Jasmine Crockett didn't walk onto that morning panel with the intention of starting a political firestorm, but she had come prepared. Known for her articulate and sharp commentary, the Texas Congresswoman had built a reputation for speaking, plainly, especially when it came to hypocrisy in public life. The show was billed as a broad conversation on public trust, political families, and integrity. It was a roundtable meant to show a cross-section of perspectives, not trigger controversy. But as often happens when honesty meets polished image, things took a sharp turn. Melania Trump was seated at the opposite end of the stage, calm and collected, clad in a refined cream-colored blazer. She spoke little at first, sticking to carefully measured points about the importance of preserving dignity in public life. Her tone was soft, her posture impeccable, and for a while, she managed to stay largely out of the line of fire. The conversation flowed politely, even cordially, touching on topics like media scrutiny, the responsibilities of political spouses, and the evolving role of women in Washington. Then came the shift. The moderator asked a general question. What does transparency mean when your private life becomes public domain? How do you reconcile mistakes, if there are any, with the public's right to know? That's when Jasmine leaned forward, folding her hands gently on the table in front of her. Her voice didn't rise. Her expression remained composed. But there was a subtle edge, one that signaled she wasn't about to give a generic answer. Transparency is not just about what we choose to share, she said. It's about what we avoid talking about. Sometimes the silence says more than the words. A few eyebrows raised around the table. The moderator nodded, expecting her to elaborate on congressional accountability or perhaps political donations. But Jasmine's gaze turned slightly toward Melania. I want to be careful here, she said calmly. This isn't about personal attacks. It's about setting the same standards for everyone. And if we're going to talk about trust and character, we can't pretend that certain people are above the conversation. There was a noticeable shift in the room. Melania, who had been quietly jotting something down on a notepad, looked up. Jasmine continued. Let's not forget that there have been real questions in the past, important ones, about how some people arrived in this country, and whether all the paperwork was, let's say, in order. A tense pause followed. No one said her name, but everyone in the studio and watching from home knew who Jasmine was talking about. The Congresswoman didn't raise her voice, didn't grandstand, didn't deliver a theatrical line. Instead, she reached into a slim folder beside her chair and pulled out a printed article from a respected publication, a piece from years ago that highlighted allegations that, before she received her official work visa, Melania may have engaged in professional modeling in the United States in violation of her tourist visa status. This isn't conspiracy theory, Jasmine said. This was reported, documented, and it matters, especially when immigration has been used as a political weapon in recent years. We don't get to demand perfection from others while ignoring questions about ourselves. The room went quiet. The moderator tried to interject, but it was too late. The moment had landed. Melania's response was composed. She stated that her immigration process had been legal and reviewed in full, and she added that she had become a naturalized citizen. After following all the necessary procedures, her tone didn't waver, but the discomfort was visible not only in her slight shift of posture, but in the way her fingers suddenly gripped the pen a little tighter. Jasmine didn't interrupt her, nor did she press further. She didn't need to. The comment had been delivered without slander, without spectacle. It had been, too many viewers, a legitimate point, that if we hold immigrants to exacting standards and make their background a matter of national scrutiny, then no one, regardless of status, title, or public image, should be excluded from that scrutiny. Social media lit up within minutes. Some accused Jasmine of targeting Melania unfairly, while others praised her for having the courage to speak on a topic that many in politics had danced around for years. In either case, what stood out most was that the conversation had changed. What was meant to be a mild discussion on political decorum had veered into the realm of hard truths, thanks to a single, quiet decision to speak the unspeakable without shouting. As Jasmine Crockett brought up the past immigration questions surrounding Melania Trump on live television, the entire tone of the room shifted. Melania, who had been poised and quiet up until that moment, suddenly became the center of attention, because she wanted to be, but because her past, long overlooked by many, was now being openly questioned. The setting wasn't one of a hostile debate or partisan bickering. It was a calm panel discussion on ethics and transparency. But even in that measured atmosphere, the impact of Jasmine's words was undeniable. From the moment the topic was raised, subtle signs of tension appeared. Melania had always maintained a carefully cultivated image, elegant, reserved, and just distant enough from the core of her husband's controversies to preserve a sense of detachment. But this moment was different. The scrutiny was directed solely at her. There was no deflecting to political opponents or shifting the topic to broader issues. This time, the question was personal. As Crockett mentioned the reports about Melania possibly having worked in the United States before receiving her proper visa, The camera briefly panned to her. Her expression remained neutral, no visible frown or outrage, but it was clear to anyone watching closely that her demeanor had stiffened. Her shoulders, previously relaxed, squared slightly. She reached for the water glass in front of her and took a deliberate sip. A classic move to buy a few seconds of composure. Then came the response. In a soft but controlled voice, Melania replied, "Those matters were addressed years ago. I went through the process legally, and I became a citizen with full transparency. I respect this country's laws and always have." It was a textbook response, measured, restrained, and devoid of any dramatic pushback. But that, in itself, was revealing. Melania didn't deny that questions had been raised about her immigration history. She didn't confront Crockett directly or accuse her of politicizing the issue. She stuck to a vague assurance that everything was addressed. Still, viewers noticed what she didn't say. She didn't offer details. She didn't mention the timeline of her visas or the work she did while on a tourist visa before her H-1B was approved. For years, those questions had hovered in the background, surfacing briefly in a few reports, but largely buried under bigger headlines about her husband, Donald Trump. When they were addressed, it was usually through a lawyer or a statement from her spokesperson, never directly by her on live television. Until now. Behind the scenes. Melania's team had always worked hard to protect her image as the more graceful and untouched figure in the Trump orbit. Compared to the bombast of her husband's political persona, she had become the picture of composure. But this exchange with Crockett disrupted that carefully drawn contrast. Here she was, suddenly having to defend herself not as a first lady, not as a mother or spouse, but as an immigrant whose personal journey may not have been as pristine as publicly presented. And the contrast was stark. Donald Trump had, during his presidency, pushed for hardline immigration policies, including the controversial family separation policy, strict visa regulations, and bans targeting specific countries. He had railed against those who abused the immigration system or bypassed its rules. So when questions arose about Melania's own immigration path, it wasn't just a personal issue, it was political. That was the subtext Jasmine Crockett had tapped into. She didn't accuse Melania of wrongdoing, but she raised a fair and piercing question. If we are to hold all immigrants to the strictest standards, should we not begin with those in the most powerful positions? Melania's discomfort wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. She did not interrupt. She did not challenge the facts. But there was a clear emotional undercurrent, something more than just irritation. Some interpreted it as frustration that this issue was resurfacing, others as embarrassment. Whatever the case, it was visible. And for someone who had built a reputation on being unshakable in the face of controversy, that moment of visible tension was telling. The moderator tried to steer the conversation back to broader themes, asking about public trust in political families. But the moment lingered. Even as Melania answered in her usual calm cadence, there was a stiffness in her delivery, a practiced tone that couldn't entirely mask the unease underneath. For perhaps the first time in a public setting, she had been directly confronted with a chapter of her past that was rarely discussed in. She had no choice but to address it, even briefly. The aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's remarks rippled across media outlets, like a wave breaking quietly but forcefully over a long-forgotten story. Almost immediately after the panel ended, clips of the exchange between Crockett and Melania Trump began circulating online. It wasn't a loud or aggressive confrontation, but that only made it more effective. People weren't watching a political brawl, they were watching a public figure, confronted with a moment of accountability she likely didn't expect. The issue Crockett raised wasn't new. In fact, it had been quietly reported during Donald Trump's presidency. Several reputable outlets had pointed to inconsistencies in Melania's early days in the U.S., specifically around her modeling work and her visa status. According to documentation reviewed by journalists, Melania had entered the U.S. in the mid-1990s on a visitor visa, which did not permit employment. Yet there were records and photos indicating that she had participated in modeling assignments during that time, work that typically requires a specific type of employment visa, such as the H-1B. Later, she obtained the appropriate visa, and, eventually, she secured permanent residency and naturalized citizenship. But those early discrepancies never fully disappeared. They simply faded from public conversation, overshadowed by the chaos of her husband's political rise. What made Crockett's remarks resonate so powerfully was their timing and the broader context. Melania's husband, Donald Trump, had built much of his political platform on a hardline stance toward immigration. He championed policies that dramatically tightened the rules for legal entry, slowed down green card processing, and clamped down on undocumented immigrants. His administration had separated families at the border, imposed travel bans, and introduced merit-based immigration criteria. And all the while, his critics pointed out the irony that his own wife may have once operated in a gray area of the immigration system he now condemned. Crockett didn't accuse Melania of a crime. She didn't suggest she was unworthy of citizenship or undeserving of her place in American society. What she did was bring to the surface the contradiction, quiet but potent, between the personal history of the former First Lady and the policies her husband had enforced on millions of others. And for a nation that had watched families torn apart over visa violations and border infractions, the idea that Melania may have once sidestepped similar rules of if briefly, deeply relevant. Commentators quickly picked up on this theme. On cable news, anchors debated whether Crockett had crossed a line, while others praised her for raising an uncomfortable but necessary point. The question isn't whether Melania is a citizen now, one legal analyst said. The question is, did she follow the same rules we expect everyone else to follow? And if she didn't, what does it say about the standards we apply, especially when her husband made immigration a centerpiece of his presidency? Social media predictably exploded. Hashtags like #Visagate and #Melania files trended throughout, but supporters of Donald Trump rushed to Melania's defense, arguing that the entire narrative was a recycled smear. Others, however, called for full transparency, demanding that Melania release all her immigration documents to clear up the questions once and for all. Even late-night comedians jumped in, poking fun at the idea that the Trump administration had pushed so hard for immigration purity while the First Lady herself had reportedly blurred some of the rules. The contradiction was too rich to ignore, and Crockett had opened the door wide. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from conservative circles. Some conservative commentators who had long defended Melania's dignity in class began urging her team to issue a formal, detailed explanation. They argued that if the Trump camp wanted to maintain credibility on immigration, it couldn't afford vague denials or half-answers, especially when the questions came from a credible source like Jasmine Crockett, who hadn't framed the issue as a political hit job, but rather a matter of consistency and fairness. Melania, for her part, remained mostly silent after the incident. A short statement was released through her spokesperson, reiterating that her immigration process was handled legally and properly at all times. But there was no follow-up, no interview, no release of documents. That silence only fueled further speculation. In the absence of clarity, the public was left with what they had seen on live television: a moment of hesitation, a visible shift in demeanor, and an unanswered question. As the media frenzy unfolded following Jasmine Crockett's but piercing remarks, Melania Trump found herself under a level of scrutiny she had largely avoided during her time in the public spotlight. But what set this moment apart wasn't just the spotlight, it was the growing sense of discomfort from figures closely tied to her husband, Donald Trump. Within days, the silence around her past became more problematic than the original allegations themselves. Pressure was mounting not only from journalists and critics but also from allies who had once gone to great lengths to shield her from controversy. Behind closed doors, conservative strategists began expressing concern. The issue wasn't only about Melania's past, it was about the optics of the Trump brand. With Donald Trump preparing for another political push, the last thing his team wanted was renewed questions about integrity and hypocrisy. If the core of his political message centered around law and order, borders, and putting America first, then the potential appearance that his own wife had possibly skirted immigration rules unintentionally posed a serious liability, especially when that contrast was being pointed out by someone as composed and credible as Representative Crockett, who hadn't resorted to sensationalism or theatrics. In private circles, campaign insiders worried. Conservative donors began asking quiet questions. Could this story grow legs? Would it impact suburban women voters who had viewed Melania as elegant, apolitical, and above the mud? More critically, how would it play in the communities most affected by Trump's own immigration policies, communities where children had been separated from parents, where visas had been denied over paperwork technicalities, and where longtime residents had been deported for infractions far less ambiguous than working on the wrong visa? The quiet discomfort grew into an internal dilemma: address the issue head-on or hope it would fade from the news cycle. Melania herself reportedly resisted making any further public comments. Her office maintained the same neutral line. Everything had been handled properly, legally, and in accordance with U.S. immigration law. But even that assertion, repeated without detail, did little to counter the growing narrative that there was something being avoided. Meanwhile, Donald Trump himself remained characteristically silent about the issue, at least publicly. He didn't lash out at Crockett or defend Melania in one of his usual tirades. Instead, his focus remained on broader political themes: campaigning, criticizing opponents, and delivering speeches at rallies. But sources close to the former president hinted that he wasn't pleased. For a man known for controlling the narrative, the fact that someone had managed to inject a wedge into his personal life's public image, and do it without yelling, was irritating in a way few things were. He'd built an entire movement on the concept of enforcing rules and punishing those who didn't follow them. This story cut too close to that core message. The longer the story lingered, the more people began to revisit past interviews, timelines, and inconsistencies. Articles that had long been buried in search results began resurfacing. Analysts dissected Melania's timeline and America her modeling contracts, the dates of her visa approvals, the statements she had made in interviews about becoming a citizen, and while no one had uncovered definitive proof of criminal wrongdoing, the lingering question remained, would an average immigrant have been treated the same way? Asterisk, the most uncomfortable truth for Trump's allies wasn't necessarily what had or hadn't happened in Melania's past. It was the perception that there were two systems, one for those with connections, and one for everyone else. And for a political movement that had long accused Washington insiders of operating above the rules, that kind of perception wasn't just embarrassing, it was damaging. Asterisk, the impact wasn't measured in polls overnight, but in the shifting tone of conservative media. Outlets that once treated Melania with complete deference began asking cautious questions. Hosts who had praised her immigration story as a model of legal success now chose their words more carefully. And across comment sections and political forums, Trump supporters found themselves in unfamiliar territory, unsure whether to defend, deflect, or demand answers. Asterisk, what Jasmine Crockett had done, without raising her voice or making accusations, was reopen a file many believed had been closed, not with bombshells or hostility, but with something much harder to refute. A calm, reasoned question that demanded the same level of scrutiny applied to others. And in doing so, she forced even the staunchest defenders of the Trump legacy to ask themselves whether selective silence was a luxury they could still afford. Asterisk. In the days that followed the quiet storm Jasmine Crockett stirred, it became clear that her words had touched a deeper nerve in the national conversation, one that extended far beyond Melania Trump herself. The issue wasn't simply whether Melania had once worked before receiving the proper visa, or if she had been fully transparent during her path to citizenship. It was about something more universal: accountability, fairness, and whether the powerful are held to the same standards as everyone else. Asterisk, for years, Melania had stood as a symbol of grace within the often turbulent Trump orbit. She rarely gave interviews, avoided overt political stances, and presented herself as someone above the partisan brawls. But that image came with its own kind of shield, a shield that, when finally pierced by Crockett's careful inquiry, revealed how little scrutiny she had truly faced compared to others. What made the moment on live television so powerful wasn't an accusation, but a question. A question that didn't require shouting to echo across the country. Asterisk, Crockett's.com demeanor, paired with a matter-of-fact delivery, forced viewers to think, not react, not argue, just think. Why had Melania's story, so often held up as an example of doing things the right way, never been fully unpacked in the same way others' immigration histories were? Why were immigrant families torn apart over technicalities, while someone connected to power seemed to glide past questions unscathed? Asterisk, the backlash didn't erupt, it simmered, and in many ways, that made it more dangerous for the Trump brand. Outrage can be dismissed, but quiet skepticism is harder to shake. Suddenly, a group that once held Melania above the fray was starting to see the cracks, not because of politics, but because of a principle that had long been championed by Donald Trump himself: the rule of law. Asterisk. Melania's choice to remain mostly silent afterward spoke volumes. In politics, silence can be strategic, but it can also be revealing. By not offering clarity, she left a vacuum that others quickly filled with speculation, commentary, and renewed investigations. And in doing so, she unintentionally lent weight to Crockett's point that some questions have been left unanswered for too long. Asterisk, ultimately, what Jasmine Crockett accomplished wasn't just exposing a potential inconsistency, it was shifting the lens. She reminded the public that accountability doesn't only apply to political rivals or those outside the spotlight. It applies to everyone, even former first ladies, even those whose stories are wrapped in elegance and quiet detachment. Asterisk, and perhaps that is what makes this moment so resonant. It wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about holding someone up to the same light that has been shown on millions of others. In doing so, Crockett didn't just expose a potential past misstep, she exposed the uneven ground on which so much of the public debate has stood. And for that, the conversation may never be